We would rate this mouse as follows. Tracking, 8 out of 10. Software, 8.5 out of 10. SteelSeries has excellent software when it comes to customizing the lighting, programming the buttons and switch functionality of the mouse. The component quality, we would give it a 6 out of 10. The buttons, they felt like decent switches. They didn't feel like the cheapest switches out there. Lighting is pretty limited to the logo and to the left and right of the palm rest. It does have some lighting interaction with the functionality of the mouse, so that's always nice to see. The button layout. This design with that flick switch, it just kind of interrupts everything. And that silver colored button is just way out of the way. The button layout's easily the weakest point. We give that a 4 out of 10. Balance is the second weakest point. When you flick up on that flick switch, it does throw the mouse off balance. And it tilts it up and rocks it on the footpad of the mouse. It's not a well-balanced mouse. There is a lot of inadvertent liftoffs and tipping for some grip styles. So that's the composition of the score. The best aspects of this mouse from our quick hands-on session is the tracking and the software. And then the component quality and the lighting, they're a little bit better than average. And then the button layout and the balance, the weakest points. Our overall score for this mouse, 6.2 out of 10. Today we're going to take a look at the Rival 5 Gaming Mouse by SteelSeries. This is a newer mouse that sits somewhere in the middle of the SteelSeries catalog when it comes to features and pricing, placing it somewhere between the Rival 310 and the Rival 600 series of mice. Let's take a look at the manufacturer specifications. This mouse has a maximum polling rate of 1000 Hz, weighs approximately 85 grams, comes equipped with golden micro IP54 switches, has 40G acceleration, 18,000 CPI, 400 IPS, 0 hardware acceleration, True Move Air Precision optical gaming sensor with true 1-to-1 tracking. Comes equipped with Prime Sync lighting that has 10 zones, configurable up to 16.8 million colors. This mouse has a matte texture finish along the plastic body. Lighting trim flanks the palm rest, and a lighted logo can be seen on the rear of the mouse. It has a braided USB cord. One thing to keep in mind is this is not an update to the Rival 500. The Rival 500 is a discontinued MMO style mouse that had a large number of configurable buttons and a shorter and wider form factor. Other than sharing a similar naming convention, this newer Rival 5 appears to be a mouse of its own, geared more toward FPS style gameplay, and for those seeking fewer buttons and a more traditional SteelSeries form factor that more closely resembles the Rival 600. Let's take a look further into that form factor. The body of the mouse is black with silver trim, and a long, slender build with a lower profile and a natural feel for a 3-finger placement on the grip. Middle, pointer, thumb. The buttons configuration of this mouse, along the top of the mouse, it has the traditional left and right click buttons that extend back over only about the first 1/3 of the mouse body. This will come into play with something that we will talk about later on. Also on the top of the mouse is a scroll wheel with middle click functionality. However, there is no scroll wheel tilt functionality on this mouse. There is also a button directly behind the scroll wheel that comes pre-programmed by default as a DPI selector. And being a single button, this means that it has single action functionality, so it can only cycle through DPI settings in one direction. Of course, this button could also be reprogrammed to suit the system owner's needs for a specific title or program. On the right side of the mouse, the pinky side of the right hand, there are no mouse buttons or switches. On the left side of the mouse, thumb side of the right hand, there are 5 programmable buttons and door switches. The uppermost thumb switch is a flick up and flick down combo switch. Two different actions can be programmed into this switch that are then individually activated when the thumb applies either upward or downward pressure on the switch. The next set of buttons below the flick switch are two side-by-side traditional depressible thumb buttons. Toward the forwardmost portion of the mouse, there is also one elongated silver-colored thumb button. This mouse is dubbed by SteelSeries as a multi-genre mouse, and utilizing the SteelSeries engine software, all of the buttons are easily reconfigurable. Alright, so let's get into the subjective arena. How did the mouse feel to us during use? Let's start with the tracking, because if that's not performing properly, then the rest of the mouse is just a big chunk of plastic. The tracking seemed responsive and precise. Wherever we were clicking, we felt confident the cursor was going to be there. If we were clicking to close the browser window, or if we were returning fire during an in-game interaction. The latency seemed to be comparable to other 1000 Hz polling rate mice. Nothing negative was observed out of the ordinary, and maybe even a slight improvement was noticed in latency when compared to something like the Rival 500. This was based on in-game events where we felt the Rival 5 had a slightly improved responsiveness while initiating character movement or returning fire in an FPS shooter game. The cable is approximately 79 inches from the end of the mouse to the USB connector. The braided cord is lengthy, but it does have a springy and heavier characteristic that can impede that wonderful sensor if the cord is not managed properly. So a cable bungee or some sort of cable management measures may need to be taken to prevent that from occurring. While utilizing the mouse, it felt secure in the hand with a slight non-slip texture on the skin of the plastic body. The scroll and DPI buttons seemed to be easy to access. The scroll wheel had decent feedback, but was easily scrollable. The left and right click buttons felt tactile, but as we mentioned above, unlike some other mice where the buttons extend back to at least one half of the mouse body with a one-piece paddle integrated into the palm rest, these buttons on the Rival 5 are individual pieces that are limited to the forward quadrant of the mouse with an abrupt seam between the left and right mouse click paddles and the palm rest. And they do only extend back about the first 1/3 of the body of the mouse. Now this shouldn't be an issue for complete palm grippers, but for some claw or fingertip grippers whose hands sit further back to the rear of the mouse, it could mean that their natural grip style might leave their fingers too far back to comfortably hit that left and right click button. And because it's not a seamless piece integrated into the palm rest, that seam will require some additional cleaning attention as well. Let's get into the thumb buttons. The left thumb buttons. They felt like a jumbled configuration during use. The flick up and flick down switch is easily one of the biggest issues that impeded our use of this mouse. So let's start with that switch. It extends off the body of the mouse further than the side-by-side buttons below it, so it makes it easy to accidentally try to press the flick switch thinking that it is one of the depressible buttons below it when you're in some intense action and you're trying to hurry up and hit one of those depressible thumb buttons. But because the flick switch extends further off the body of the mouse, it will draw more attention from the thumb due to that protruding factor overshadowing the depressible buttons below it. Now the traditional side-by-side buttons below that flick switch are tucked under the flick switch deep enough back that it can make finding them a little bit of a task when those milliseconds count during in-game exchanges, particularly a medium or larger thumb. Another issue with the flick switch is that it requires the thumb to swipe up and down to activate. Now this can be contrary to the usual coordination of movement of simultaneously tracking the mouse side by side or back and forth on the mouse pad while attempting to engage those thumb switches by flicking the thumb up and or down while moving side to side with your arm or your hand and back and forth. It can make for an interesting combination of coordinating movements. So you can kind of imagine moving your wrist or your arm left to right, back and forth on the mouse pad while simultaneously flicking your thumb up or up and then down to activate that flick switch. It's kind of like doing the rub your tummy and pat your head thing. It can kind of get a little bit of a discoordinated sequence of movements going. So that's our second issue with the flick switch. It may take a while for some people to invest enough time to commit all of that to muscle memory. Also, while flicking the upward pressure on that flick switch, it does require just enough force that it can lift the mouse off the pad in order to get the upward flick action to activate, creating another tracking interruption with the mouse. Also, while sliding the thumb up and down over the flick switches, there are moments where this relieves the counter pressure that is usually applied by the thumb to counter the pinky side of the hand. And when this thumb liftoff occurs to go up and down over the flick switch, the momentary removal of the thumb from the side of the mouse can leave that side of the mouse feeling rudderless, creating tracking interruptions for any simultaneous side-to-side or back-and-forth movements being undertaken at the time that the flick switch is being engaged. To get that articulation, we'll have our pinky on the right side, we'll have our thumb on the left side. Well, when we swipe our thumb up, our pinky is still articulating on the right side, but we lose that articulation factor on the left side. So we can still move with our hand, but we're not getting that little rudder action, that little control that we receive by having our thumb on the left side of the mouse. Now the side-to-side buttons below the flick switch are small, but when the thumb can hit them, seem to be tactile and be pressed cleanly. Though for claw or tip grippers, the second forwardmost button may end up being just too far enough out of reach to access at moments when maintaining precise movement matters. And that forwardmost silver-colored thumb button was too far out of reach for us to utilize while maintaining any sort of competent control over this mouse, as it required either the entire hand to be rotated to bring the thumb forward far enough, or a total grip readjustment by inching up on the mouse body with the entire hand for the thumb to finally make contact with that switch. Both of which interrupt the hand's simultaneous lateral and axial control over the mouse tracking, as well as interrupts access to the other buttons. So overall, who is this mouse best geared toward? Most likely palm grippers, because claw grippers and tip grippers may find only one of the thumb buttons to be seamlessly usable, while the top left and right click buttons may prove to be too far forward for these grip styles to comfortably make effective contact over a longer period of use. So it may create quite a bit of fatigue for claw or fingertip grippers. Palm grippers may do best, maybe medium. It's hard to say what hand size would do best because, well, if you had a larger hand, you might be able to reach that silver-colored thumb button more easily, so you might be able to get some use out of that once in a while. But if you had a larger thumb, you're going to have a harder time articulating the two depressible buttons underneath of the flick switch, where a smaller thumb would come in handy and be able to get up and under that flick switch and maybe get some articulation on those switches. So I think it's a quirky enough mouse that if you're considering this mouse, maybe try to get it locally so that you can return it if you're not happy with it, because it's going to take a particular person to get a good fit on this mouse. It's going to take a particular personality, a person with a certain biomechanics and ergonomic expectations that it just happens to sync with their gameplay somehow. And they're going to invest the time to commit this button configuration to muscle memory so that they can make it work better for them. But I think overall the suggestion would be, if you're interested in this mouse, get it somewhere that either has free returns or locally where you can just jump back up to the store and return it if you're not happy with it. One other important takeaway to remember, this is not an update to the rival 500. This is a completely different mouse, even though it has the rival 5 in the name. It's a completely different mouse. For something like the rival 500, you may want to check out something like the EVGA X15 if you're looking for a replacement for that, even though it's not identical. But we've been testing that mouse out and it's been showing some promise. We'll try to do a review of that next. But yeah, the rival 5 gaming mouse by SteelSeries, placing it someplace between the rival 310 and the rival 600. But I think if you're happy with either one of those mice, this mouse is not going to be something that's going to change the game. And that flick switch, we're not new to flick switches because the rival 500 had a couple of flick switches as well, but they were placed at the bottom of the thumb rest and it was just a downward flick action. So one of them was a little bit more usable than the ones we have found on the rival 5. The rival 5, during intense in-game action, the flick switch wasn't really usable for us, except for maybe downward, because that upward pressure on the switch just requires just enough force that it lifts the mouse off the pad, just enough to interrupt tracking. Just millisecond here, millisecond there, losing out on exchanges trying to activate that flick switch during an intense interaction in the game, and it's just enough to come out with the short end of the stick. This is the rival 5 gaming mouse that may just fit somebody out there somewhere. Do you currently own this mouse? Are you loving it? Are you not loving it? Have you found a way to make it work for you?
Let us feel the vibe.
This has been a Red Eye